Test, 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 test. Um, he said hello, David. You were gone so fast that you couldn't hear my response. Okay, so I'm hoping. She said hello, David, and by the time I looked up to see who it was, I caught her through the glass going through the door. So there's a lot of material this week that I kind of hope to get through in Exodus chapter 16. And remember the last story, the last account that we had was the Israelites drinking the bitter water at Marah. And then they went to Elam where there were plenty of 12 springs and 70 palm trees. And we talked about that was a spring per tribe. They could all gather around their own spring and eat their or drink their water. And so you get water, so they were thirsty. What do you suppose the other thing that goes along with being thirsty? They're probably hungry. So if we turn the next page over to the next chapter, we see Exodus 16. And this is always a part to just kind of remind everybody when the Israelites left Egypt, were they poor or were they quite wealthy? Did they get a lot of stuff or were they just, they'd gotten a lot of gold, they'd gotten a lot of clothes, they'd gotten a lot of cattle, they had all sorts of provisions with them. And we turn around in chapter 16 and we see the whole Israelite community set out from Elam and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elam and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had come out. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If we only had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt, there we sat around pots of meat, and we ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." Then the Lord said to Moses, "I will rain down bread from heaven." Let's stop right there before we get any further. So they had clearly all the ability, if they wanted to cook them, and I don't know. I mean, you get, what do we say, uh, probably somewhere around 3 million people. Is that what we decided last week? Somewhere around 3 million people eating. I don't know how many cows it takes to feed 3 million people on a day, for them to eat, but I'm sure they could go through their livestock fairly quickly, uh, in a couple of months. You could realize, hey, we're running out of food. And they're wandering around in the desert. And we went to New Mexico on spring break, and I can only, as I was driving through there, I was thinking this must be what it would be like to wander around in um, the wilderness outside of Mount Sinai, on their way. a deserted land with a bunch of sagebrush everywhere. I've seen some pictures from Israel and some of the outlying areas and whatnot. Just from that part of the world, I can only imagine what it would be like. And to sit here and think that, they were walking through lush pastures and lots of wildlife or whatnot, I can see how people would start to say, we're going to starve to death out here. And so I don't like to be too hard on the Israelite people for complaining about no food. There might have been an easier way to approach God and say, hey, we're kind of hungry. Is there anything God can do for us for food? But they complained and they said, if only we had just died in Egypt. Life was so much better in Egypt. And sometimes that's the way our lives are too, right? In different seasons of life, changes and transitions we may be going through, we may say, well, life was better previously and now it's getting worse, and I'm not sure that we made the right decision by leaving Egypt and whatnot. So, I think that they have a fairly legitimate complaint. I don't think that they went about it the right way, of complaining to God. They maybe asked him, before you get to complaining, just ask him, speak up and say something. But I think that you can look at this and say that they were most certainly not just completely ridiculous for the things that they were saying. So God is going to give them. In verse 4, it's interesting because it says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day." What was the next line? Right. "In that way I'm going to test them." Okay? So in this way I will test them whether they will follow my instructions. In preparation for the sermon today, there were some Old Testament passages that I was looking at. And when you look at some of the prophecies about the new kingdom, the New Testament church, and the way Christianity should be practiced, in some of those Old Testament prophecies about it, in Ezekiel particularly, God says, because of all the things that I do for the people, they will be careful to keep all of my decrees. And I look at, the Christianity that's being preached across America today about grace and freedoms and do whatever you want to because God's grace will abound. And, I think Paul probably appropriately dealt with that in Romans chapters, 5 and 6. I think where 5 was the one that says, wherever sin abound, God's grace did much more abound. And then I think it's chapter 6 he turns over, it may be 7. I may have my numbers wrong. Turns over the next chapter and goes, so what? Should we just go on sinning and just keep sinning so that God's grace can abound? Forbid that thought to even cross your mind. How can we who have died to sin continue to live therein? So, Paul kind of addressed that idea that where there's freedom that you should just, no, that's not what we should be doing. So anyway, God says he's going to test them and see if they're going to follow his instructions. Okay, and it's interesting because when we get through this, I want y'all to think about what would be the consequences for breaking God's instructions or not keeping God's instructions. We're going to talk about that hopefully this morning if we can get through this entire thing quick enough. So verse 5 says, on the 6th day they are to prepare what they bring in, and that is going to be twice as much as they gather on the other days. Okay. So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, in the evening you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. And in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we that you should grumble against us? Moses and Aaron. Why are you grumbling against Moses and Aaron? They're just people. Who are you? Who are we that you're complaining about us? God is the one who's done this. So verse 8, Moses also said, "You will know that it was the Lord when he gives you meat to eat in the evening and all the bread you want in the morning, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we? You are not to grumble. You are not grumbling against us, but against the Lord." Then Moses told Aaron, "Say to the entire community, 'Go before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling.'" While Aaron was speaking to the whole Israelite community, they looked towards the desert, and there was the glory of the Lord appearing in the clouds. The Lord said to Moses, "I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites. Tell them, at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will be filled with bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God." That evening quail came and covered the camp. And in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. And when the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, "It is the bread the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Everyone is to gather as much as they need. Take an omer." Does anybody have anything besides an omer right there? Take an omer. Verse, where did I just? Verse 16. Okay. Okay. We'll talk about what an omer is here in just a minute. Take an omer for each person you have in your tent. The Israelites did as they were told. Some gathered much, some little. And when they measured it by the omer, the one who had gathered much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little. Everyone had gathered just as much as they needed. Then Moses said to them, "No one is to keep any of it until morning." However, some of them paid no attention to Moses. They kept part of it until morning. But it was full of maggots and began to smell, so Moses was angry with them. Each morning everyone gathered as much as they needed, and when the sun grew hot, it melted away. On the 6th day, they gathered twice as much, 2 omers for each person. And the leaders of the community came and reported this to Moses. And he said to them, "This is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow is to be a day of Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. So bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil. Save whatever is left and keep it until morning." So they saved it until morning as Moses commanded, and it did not stink or get maggots in it. "Eat it today," Moses said, "because today is the Sabbath to the Lord. You will not find any of it on the ground. 6 days you are to gather it, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, there will not be any." Nevertheless, some of the people went out on the 7th day to gather it, but they found none. Then the Lord said to Moses, "How long will you refuse to keep my commands and my instructions? Bear in mind that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. That is why on the 6th day he gives you bread for 2 days. Everyone is to stay where they are on the 7th. No one is to go out." So the people rested on the 7th day. The people of Israel called the bread manna. It was white like coriander seed and tasted like wafers made with honey. Moses said, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Take an omer of manna and keep it for the generations to come, so that they can see the bread I gave you to eat in the wilderness when I brought you out of Egypt." So Moses said to Aaron, "Take a jar and put an omer of manna in it. Then place it before the Lord to be kept for the generations to come." As the Lord commanded Moses, Aaron put the manna in the tablets. As the Lord commanded Moses, Aaron put the manna with the tablets of the covenant law so that it might be preserved. The Israelites ate manna 40 years until they came to a land that was settled. They ate manna until they reached the border of Canaan. And then there's a footnote in the Bible that says an omer is 1/10 of an ephah. And so there we go. What do y'all want to talk about first? The tests, the Sabbath, or what an omer is?
Can I just bring up, I never knew, I always heard the story of the manna, but I've never heard of him eating the doves,
The quail?
the quail.
Yeah.
I just never
Yeah, they're going to complain about quail before too long. If you go eat quail right now in like Oklahoma City, a few restaurants you can eat quail. It's expensive. It's very good. I love it. I used to hunt quail, but yeah, yeah. So they ate meat. They didn't. They ate meat in the evening. Quail covered the entire camp, and then in the morning they had something that they called manna. Manna literally means what is it? So that's what they didn't know what it was. They called it manna because they didn't know what it was. It was bread from heaven, flakes like frost on the ground, and when the sun came out, it burned it all up. You couldn't. I wonder if this was tofu. Yeah, that's tofu. What is that stuff anyway, right? Yeah, what is it anyway? If it burns up in the sun, then I'm pretty sure that was tofu that God sent to everybody to eat. I don't know. Okay, so which one? What do y'all want to start with? Mm-hmm. Well, later the glory of the Lord is going to show up, and it's going to be a super bright light. It'll be it'll right, yeah, and that's me too. And I really honestly don't have a good like. There's not a little nugget of some information I got behind that one, so that's why I didn't bring it up. But right, but it is one of those things. What does that look like to you? What does that even mean? How is it that they look out and they see the glory of God? And what does that mean? Do you? So George Strait's got that song, "I Saw God Today," and when you think about it, uh, um, Elijah wanted to see or experience God, and so God sent him all these big, boisterous things, right, that you would think would be somewhat of the presence of God. And we'll actually look at that in a couple of chapters. There's going to be the presence of God showing up. And Jesus, man, used some really cool language that we have. I've seen T-shirts and coffee mugs and posters and signs made out of this line that Jesus said. And I doubt that any of us picture Mount Sinai as being what Jesus was talking about. But I think that's what Jesus was talking about after doing some learning on some stuff that we'll look at here in a couple of weeks. But the glory of God, when you see the glory of God shown around them, what does that mean? To me, it's like you take this picture and you try to build in your mind's eye what it looks like. But I would think that it would be like some sort of a, what was that, the star that shined so that the wise men or the Magi knew that it was time, right? What was it? Was that the glory of God that they saw and it appeared to them and they were able to see that? But anytime you see this, a lot of the stuff in the New Testament, particularly around the temple and the tabernacle, the glory of God's going to fill the tabernacle, and then it's going to fill the temple, and it is a presence that is so powerful that the glory of God is going to be emanating out of the Ark of the Covenant, and the Philistines are going to steal it. And this glory of God is like radiation to them, and they have boils, and they have all sorts of things that what we would think of today as radiation poisoning, and like the things that happened in Chernobyl whenever you had the nuclear reactor incident out there, and you're sitting there thinking, well, was this uranium that was in the Holy Ark or something like that those weaponized nuclear weapons God was using? All these different ideas about what it is, but there is something that they experienced in many of these cases, and I'm not sure that this was actually telling you that they saw a vision of some sort that was a glory of God, or it was something added in by the author, right, of this book, because they're going to talk about putting this deal of manna with the Ten Commandments. But when they're eating when they're at this time, when they're introducing this, and he apparently gathers this jar, there's no Ark of the Covenant yet. They haven't built that. They haven't made it to Mount Sinai. So There's some timeline things that if you go and you say, well, in perfect sequence, this hasn't happened yet. They don't have the Ark of the Covenant for them to be able to, Ark of the Testimony for them to be able to put that in there. Mm-hmm. Well, and that's part of what the Sabbath is for, is to take a moment to step back. And that's, so we'll just talk about the Sabbath right here. God introduced the Sabbath to them, and later we're going to see God introduce the Sabbath or talk about the Sabbath because on 6 days he created heavens and earth and whatnot, and on the seventh day he rested. So, you should find some time to rest. What are the Israelites coming from? Egypt, and what was their occupation in Egypt? They were slaves. As a slave, are you valued because you are one of God's creatures, or are you valued because you can perform work? Right? In American system of employment and culture and whatnot, are you valued? Honestly, different people that I know of that have aged and I've talked to on this thing, they say people don't see my value anymore. They don't see me as a valuable person. Are we valued in our culture for being people, or are we valued in our culture for what we can do for society? We're valued for what we can do for society. Famously, Kennedy said, ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. Companies have taken that line, right? Don't ask the company what the company can do for you, but as your employer, what can we get out of you? And if you reach a point in your employment and you were one time maybe a top salesperson, or maybe you were one of the most productive, machinist or pharmacist or whatever, and then now all of a sudden you've slowed down a little bit, they want to take your money away. Well, you're no longer as valuable to us. They want to demote you. They want to say, you can no longer do this job, so we got to demote you and take away some pay, and we no longer value you because you can't do anything. So the Israelites are a group of people that have been told for a couple of 100 years while they were down in Egypt that their only value is the work that they produce. So they were worked long, hard days, no rest, no breaks. Matter of fact, that 3-day break, Pharaoh couldn't even give them 3 days off to go worship God because how are we ever going to make up for that productivity? We see in America the companies that choose to, it was newsworthy that Lowe's is going to be closed next Sunday. So if you guys were planning on after Easter going to Lowe's and buying flowers and whatnot to plant in your garden, they're closed on Easter. Maybe that's fake news, I don't know. Maybe it's real news. But it was something that came across my feed of information several times that Lowe's is going to close every one of their 1,700 stores for one day. Can you believe the productivity they're going to lose? Can you believe the profits they're going to lose from not operating that one day? And God says, don't fall into that trap. You're worth having a day off. You're worth time to yourself. So, 6 days you'll go out and you'll gather your food. But on that 7th day, I want you to stay home and do nothing. You know how hard it is to stay home and do nothing? Vicki, right? You're very busy, right? You just said that a while ago. Do you know how hard it is to stay home and do nothing? Scott, you talked about, you practiced this a few times, trying to take a Saturday completely off or whatever. No phone, no TV, no nothing, just do nothing. Go crazy. Yeah. It is amazing. And you think, what all things am I not getting done? And the truth is what? You don't get them done, they're still there tomorrow. You get them done, guess what? They're still there tomorrow. It's a lot of times you're looking at chores and it's like, the dishes, man, I got to get all the dishes done. Guess what? If you don't do the dishes, they're still there tomorrow. Right? If you don't get all the laundry done, it's still there tomorrow. And all these like daily tasks that sometimes overwhelm us and make us feel like we're so busy and so rushed and so everything, you don't have time. So God says to his people here, you've got to learn that you're valuable not because of what you can do, but because you're one of my creatures. You're my creation. I made you. You're made in God's image. Each one of us made in God's image. John chapter 9, verse 3 that we looked at last week. What's the purpose, or who, this guy who was born blind, who sinned? Like, he's worthless. He can't even see. Like, he's not valued in our society, in the Roman society back then, right? Probably not even valued in the American society today, because it's what can you do for us? And Jesus said, purpose of this guy is to, show glory of God. This guy is created in God's image. And it's like when you can stop seeing dollar signs and productivity and chores getting done and checking the box of all the to-do list, and you can just start seeing people for being people, right? And you can start seeing yourself not as somebody who gets all this stuff done and is top salesperson or whatever else, but instead just, I am me. And if I do nothing today, I'm still valuable, right? That's hard. I bet every one of us in this room struggle with, if I do nothing, am I still valuable? Right? If I accomplish nothing today, was this a good day? And I bet we all struggle with that. And if we don't struggle with it now, we probably did at some point in our life. And so the Israelites are having to learn what it means to be God's chosen people. Remember at the very beginning of God's discussion with Moses, he says something that we've struggled with through different parts of the story to this point is God says, they may have known my name as Yahweh back there before now, but I'm going to show you truly who Yahweh is. So we get this rule right here. God's going to test them. Okay, so we get this rule here on the Sabbath. Let's go with the Sabbath, and then we'll talk about God testing. We'll get the rule on the Sabbath. And interesting enough, if they wanted to go out and do something and accomplish anything on the Sabbath, right, on that seventh day, there was no bread for them to gather. There was no quail for them to gather. What are they really honestly going to do? I mean, honestly, what else is there to do? I was just seriously thinking about in New Mexico, there's nothing but sagebrush out there. And if you're wandering around out there and God is raining down your food, in the morning he's giving you manna, in the evening he's giving you quail, and on the seventh day he gives you nothing, what honestly are you going to do? You can wander around, you can do a whole bunch of things and never accomplish anything. You can't accomplish anything on that Sabbath day, right? God said, I'm going to give you a Sabbath to keep. And you're going to have to learn this lesson. But guess what? Even if you don't want to learn that lesson the easy way, and you try to go out and accomplish something on this day, you're not going to accomplish anything. Because there's nothing for you to do today. Took away all of their things. They're in the middle of the desert. Can't do anything except for do the task that God gave them. And so if they try to do it, guess what? Can't accomplish anything. And these people, I guarantee you, are struggling with why in the world is God taking away our work? This is where we see value in ourselves and where we see purpose in ourselves. But God says your purpose is not in your work, and your value as a person is not in the things that you can accomplish. And that's very much a lesson for us to all learn today, right? It's a very big lesson for us to learn today. So the other thing that he told them about was this gathering in Omer. Now, the interesting thing about it is how they measured an Omer. So we said 2 quarts. I don't think they had a mason jar or 1 quart that they were able to go out and say, look, here, I'll measure out 2 mason jars of this food, of this manna, and apparently they could boil it. Apparently they could bake it. I don't know, maybe they made quail dumplings, right, boiling it. Perhaps they made biscuits and quail. I don't know. Said it tasted like wafers with honey. That sounds pretty good. I mean, think about like the graham crackers, the honey-made graham crackers. Man, pretty good stuff, right? So the Omer was a skull. So, people died, and I'm sure somewhere along the way they said, if you look at this, and it's a nice little bowl right here. But an Omer was a skull. And so it really comes down and he says, I want you to gather enough for a person. One skull. Gather enough for one person. And I don't know how it plays out to where those who gathered a whole bunch, right? Because it said that there were people who gathered a whole bunch, and there were people who gathered just very little. But when they poured it into the skull, they had just enough. And I don't know if God filled up the skull, or those who had gathered little just had little heads, or I don't know. I don't really know how this is. But if you were a person who said, I'm going to outperform Jason, if I came out and I said, I'm going to outperform Jason, and I'm going to go gather up armfuls of this stuff that we don't even know what it is, we don't even know why we want it, right? God says, oh, this is the resource out here. I want to gather as much of the resources as I can. Whenever I poured it into my omer, I only had an omer full. But I thought I gathered a whole bunch. No, you just gathered enough for one skull. And if I go, well, that didn't work out. I see Jason over there working so hard to beat me. This time I'm just going to gather a little bit. See how God can handle that. All right, it's time to pour what you gathered into your omer. You poured in there. I have enough. So what does that tell you? Whether you gather a whole bunch or you gather a little bit, it's not you that's taking care of yourself. And you have to learn that whatever you do to take care of yourself, to gather all those things, there's plenty of resources, right? There's plenty available. It's not a scarce resource. You don't have to gather so much to make sure you get taken care of. There's enough for everybody. But God's going to take care of whatever you gather. You gather a little bit, maybe you didn't feel well today. Maybe your knees were hurting and you didn't want to walk around and gather a bunch of stuff up. God says, I got you taken care of. Maybe you thought, I'm going to be super productive today and I'm going to get a whole bunch. God says, nope, you just got enough. Well, apparently, there were some people who figured out how to cheat God. I don't know how they tried to do this. I don't know if they ate half as much as what they should have needed for a day, or they somehow tricked God and they gathered an omer and stashed it and gathered another omer and look, this is my omer, right? And they saved it for the next day because they thought, I am going to, deal with tomorrow's bread today. God says you can't do that. So when they went to go open their omer to get their food for today, it had maggots in it and it was smelly. Everybody knew it. We did this test whenever I was in second grade, Mrs. Scott's class. I always like to be the first one doing my test. That was always a big challenge. Be the first one done, first one to turn in your assignment in the class, right? That was always a big challenge. And so Miss Scott gave us this dumb test that made me look like an idiot. And so it was like you needed to, read the instructions and then start answering all the questions. And the instructions said, read the last question first. So those who read and then the last question said, write your name on your piece of paper and sit at your desk quietly and observe what else is going on. So I'm over there stomping my feet, clapping my hands and everything. Next thing you know, I told them myself, right? Everybody in the class knew who didn't read the instructions. Everybody knew. So everybody in the whole camp knew who didn't read the instructions or follow the instructions. The person who tried to cheat the system, they got told on because there was a foul odor coming from this manna, right? This is not about can you gather enough. God will take care of you. And Jesus said, give us today our daily bread. Give us today our daily bread. It came right back from this lesson. The lesson from the omer. You can't gather too much today for tomorrow. God says, I'm not going to allow that. You gather just enough. And I want you to understand I'll take care of you. Right? And Jesus gives so many lessons over, is God going to people, God, there's not enough resources in the world. God says there's plenty. Right? Today we fight and we have wars over resources. So we say we're going to run out of resources. And I haven't seen them, in my lifetime. I was told as a kid the oil was a very scarce resource. And I see us burning and using more oil today than we did back then. And they're not stopping producing this stuff. I don't know how it's magically coming out of the ground or what, but there doesn't really honestly seem like there's any shortage. And there's oil wells that were supposed to go dry 20 years ago that are still producing oil today. I have no idea where oil comes. I'm not a geologist, and I'm not a person of that, but I'm just telling you, these scarce resources, we trick our minds into saying that there's scarcity in the world, and God tries to tell us all that there's plenty. You don't have to fight with your neighbor about having enough. There's plenty to go around. So, God gave them a command. Said every day you're supposed to go out and gather just enough. And if I try to cheat the system, and I try to gather as much as I possibly could so that I could prove how my productivity and my worth to the community, because I can gather so much manna, God says, magically that's just enough for only you. You didn't gather enough for everybody else. And if I go out and I say, well, I'm going to test God, and I'm only going to gather one little spoonful or whatever, I'm just going to gather a little bit, and you look at it and you go, that was enough. How does that work out, right? God says, I'm going to test you. Are you going to trust me? Go out and gather what you need. So go gather your fair share, and if you gather your fair share, it'll be okay. Now, there's some other lesson that I heard on this, and I don't know if this is the way it was, but that everybody was supposed to gather what they wanted, put it in a big pile, and then it is measured out. And whenever you measured it out, it turned out to be just enough for everybody in the community. And so they gave this big deal. When we all work together and we pitch in, we all have just enough, right? And I don't know. Seemed like this was on an individual basis, right? That if I went out and I gathered a whole bunch thinking I was going to be super productive, whenever I measured it out, I only had an omer. Right? Yes, sir.
You said a second ago, maybe some people try to cheat God or
Mm-hmm.
God or something. The way I read it here is they had their omer when they, if they didn't finish it, they didn't eat what they had. The way I read it, that's when it turned to maggots the next day.
Yeah, but then somehow on Saturday it worked out, or on Friday, it worked out to where
It'll be okay.
it didn't rot on Saturday, right? So when God said, save it for the next day, it didn't rot. When God didn't say, save it for the next day, it rotted. So here, let me ask you this question. Every person was supposed to go out and gather an omer, right? Was it possible for them to gather more than an omer? I mean, because like we just talked about that with that one person that saved some over for the next day, but it kind of seems like they just saved some over for the next day. Was it possible for them to gather more than an omer? Because the Bible says that whenever they gathered whatever they gathered and they measured it out, each person only had an omer. So whether they gathered a bunch or they gathered a little, each person only had an omer. But God said he was going to test them, and he gave them this rule that says, go gather an omer. Was it possible for them to break that rule? And the truth is no, it wasn't possible for them to break that rule. And God said, you know what? Don't save any of it for tomorrow. Eat it all today. Was it possible for them to break that rule? Well, if they tried to, everybody in the camp knew that they didn't follow that rule because it stank to high heavens, right? And so God gave them another rule that it was impossible for them to keep. It was impossible for them to not keep, right? They had to keep that rule because if they saved any of it for tomorrow, it was bad anyway, right? So you might as well eat it today. It's going to go bad by tomorrow. Well, it was possible, but they didn't accomplish anything by it. They weren't able to not gather tomorrow because they saved today, right? Today was the bread that they could eat. And then the other rule that he said to them was on the seventh day, you're not to gather anything. Was it possible for them to break that rule? They could have tried. We talked about it. They could walk around the desert if they wanted to, but they weren't going to gather any manna and they weren't going to catch any quail. And so really honestly, God gave them 3 rules that it was nearly impossible, or it really honestly was impossible for them to break those rules. But they were rules that they could only follow. And he's about to give them some additional rules, right? We fast forward to Mount Sinai. What famously come at Mount Sinai? The 10 Commandments, right? And Moses received the entire law. He ends up given 613 total laws for them to keep. And there will be laws that it is possible for them to break those laws. But these people learned obedience. And I think about Jesus learning obedience. And these people learned obedience through laws which it was impossible for them to break. Because if they tried to break them, it didn't accomplish anything. They were not able to gather too much. It was impossible. The scriptures tell us that when they measured it out, they only had enough for one omer. It was impossible for them to save over for the next day, because when they did, it stank to high heavens and it was rotting with maggots. And it was impossible for them to not keep the Sabbath, because there was nothing else for them to do. But God says, what I want you to understand is you need to trust me, right? Trust me. I got this. And so by giving you 3 rules that it's impossible for you to break, you will learn how to trust. And that's one of the big keys about the manna rules, right? Is that they are the first commands that God gave to his people outside of their slavery, right? They're the first rules that he really sets down. I'm going to give you these rules. And in these rules, you're going to learn how to obey me. But if you don't obey me, guess what? You don't get any of the benefits from not obeying. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's very interesting, that idea of just first thing in the morning, I need to wake up and I need to thank God for returning for waking up. I thank you for waking me up today, and for giving me life, and for all the blessings that I will receive throughout this day. And then, that last day, to have that time to look back and say, man, here it is, another week has gone by, and God has sustained me. Towards the end of my grandpa's career being a farmer, I set out and, talking to him about different careers. And I was probably late teens, early 20s, just sitting there thinking about life ahead of me and whatnot. And I said, something to him about, I really think that the life of a farmer, I think I'd like to have that. And he said, boy, it's a tough life. And then he stopped and he goes, but I've always had enough. I've always had enough. And, so many times I think about how I've fallen into the 401k trap, right? That I need to work to put money into a bank account that I can access one of these days. And so that at some point I can retire and I can take care of things, but God says that he gave me enough today. And, maybe one of the lessons about the enough today is that there's plenty today, and tomorrow there'll be plenty, and the next day there'll be plenty. And I'll give you a day of rest, and there'll be plenty for it too. And there'll be plenty. And just come to me every morning. Do what you need to do today, and I'll take care of it. And that's one of the great lessons that the Israelites were commanded to learn right there. They're valuable for being God's children. God's going to give them a special mission. He's about to tell them that they are chosen of all the nations. And Some people take that chosenness for the wrong reasons. And God is going to tell them, and is very, oh my goodness, guys, the lesson over Mount Sinai, it'll take several weeks, but it's magnificent to learn what they were supposed to learn there and what we're supposed to know, and then fast forward to Jesus and be able to extend that even further. So, but anyway, we'll get into 17 next week, and very quickly we'll be to Mount Sinai, chapter 19, and we'll spend a lot of time on 19 and 20. But I want you guys to be thinking about the Ten Commandments. And I want you to just think about what you think they are all about. What's the Ten Commandments about? And we might be surprised about what they really are truly about. So, anyway, we'll go from there.